Picture this. You wake in the dark. Your eyes open, but nothing else will move. Your arms won't lift. Your legs won't respond. You try to scream, but your voice has abandoned you completely. And then you see it. A shadow, a figure, standing at the foot of your bed or sitting on your chest, crushing the air from your lungs. You know, with absolute certainty, that you are not alone, that something is in the room with you. Something that shouldn't be there. This is sleep paralysis, and for thousands of years, across every continent in cultures that never met or shared stories, people have described the exact same thing, the same crushing weight, the same presence, the same terror. Science tells us it's a glitch in the brain, a moment when consciousness wakes before the body can move, when dream logic bleeds into waking reality. A simple explanation for a universal experience. But then, why do so many people see the same figures? Why do the descriptions match across centuries and continents? Why does the Old Hag of Newfoundland look just like the Shadow Man of Japan, the Night Crusher of Scandinavia, the Demon of medieval Europe? Welcome to Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. If you enjoy deep investigations into the unexplained, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there, and whether you've ever experienced sleep paralysis yourself. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to set the atmosphere, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Now, let's begin. The medical explanation for sleep paralysis is, on the surface, perfectly reasonable. During REM sleep, the deepest stage of dreaming, your brain paralyzes your body. It's a protection mechanism, preventing you from acting out your dreams, from thrashing or walking or harming yourself while unconscious. But sometimes, the system fails. Your mind wakes up before the paralysis releases. You're conscious, aware, trapped in a body that won't respond. Hallucinations often accompany this state. The brain, still partially dreaming, projects images into the waking world. Shadows become figures. Ambient sounds become footsteps. The weight of your own chest pressing against the bed becomes something sitting on you. It happens to roughly 8% of the general population at least once in their lifetime. Higher rates among students, shift workers, people with disrupted sleep schedules. It's documented, it's studied, it's understood. And yet, the details are where the official explanation begins to fray. In Newfoundland, they call it the Old Hag. An elderly woman who appears in the night, sits on your chest, and slowly crushes the breath from your body. Victims describe her weight, her smell, the feel of her presence pressing down. They see her face, withered, ancient, malevolent. The accounts date back generations, passed down through fishing communities isolated from the rest of the world, people who'd never heard of sleep paralysis, who had no framework for what was happening to them. But they all described the same woman. In Japan, there's Kanashibari, literally bound in metal. The experience is identical: paralysis, terror, and frequently a presence. Sometimes a shadow figure, sometimes something worse. The cultural interpretation differs, but the core experience remains unchanged. Medieval Europe called them incubi and succubi, demons that visited in the night, pressed down on the chest, and violated those they visited. The church took these accounts seriously. Exorcisms were performed, protections were blessed, because people weren't just afraid, they were traumatized. Scan the globe. Botswana has the Segakolodi, a creature that sits on you while you sleep. In Egypt, it's the Jinn pressing down in the darkness. In Turkey, Karabasan, the dark presser. In Mexico, Subirse el Muerto, the dead one climbing on top of you. Different languages, different belief systems, different eras. The same experience. Science explains this as pattern recognition, the brain filling in gaps with familiar archetypes, cultural conditioning, shaping hallucinations into culturally relevant forms. The Old Hag appears to Newfoundlanders because that's the story they grew up hearing. The Shadow Man appears to modern Americans because we've replaced folkloric demons with contemporary ones. It's a tidy explanation, but that wasn't the strangest part. Because these descriptions existed long before people could compare notes, long before the internet, before global communication, before anthropologists could document cross-cultural similarities. Isolated communities, separated by oceans and centuries, describing identical experiences down to unsettling detail. The weight on the chest, almost universal. The inability to move or scream, consistent across cultures. The sense of malevolent presence, overwhelming, undeniable. And the figures themselves, humanoid but wrong, shadow-like, ancient, evil. If this is simply the brain misfiring, why does it misfire in such a specific, predictable pattern? Why don't people see their mothers, their pets, their favorite childhood cartoon characters? Why always something dark, something predatory, something that radiates intent? Dr. J. Allen Cheney, a psychologist at the University of Waterloo, has studied sleep paralysis extensively. His research identifies 3 distinct categories of hallucination that occur during episodes: the intruder, the incubus, and unusual bodily experiences. The intruder is a sensed presence, often accompanied by fear. The incubus is pressure on the chest and breathing difficulties. The bodily experiences include floating, out-of-body sensations, spinning. His work is thorough, scientific, peer-reviewed, and it still doesn't answer the fundamental question: why these 3 categories? Why not 4 or 17 or completely random experiences? Why does the phenomenon organize itself so consistently? Cheney suggests it's neurological, specific brain regions activating in specific sequences during the transition between sleep and waking. The amygdala fires, triggering fear. The brain's threat detection systems activate without external stimulus. The body's positional awareness becomes distorted. But even this explanation requires something remarkable: that human neurology, across all populations, in all time periods, generates identical false perceptions when caught in this specific state. That evolution has, for some reason, hardwired us to experience the same nightmare. What happened next raised even more questions, because while science studied the mechanism, it largely ignored the aftermath. Sleep paralysis episodes last, on average, between a few seconds and several minutes. Brief, temporary, harmless. Yet the psychological impact can persist for years. People develop insomnia, afraid to sleep because they know it might return. They refuse to sleep alone. They leave lights on. They experience genuine PTSD symptoms, flashbacks, hypervigilance, panic attacks triggered by darkness or the sensation of lying down. One woman interviewed by researchers described an episode where a shadowy figure stood at the foot of her bed for what felt like hours. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only watch as it slowly approached. When she finally regained control and scrambled for the light switch, nothing was there. But she felt its presence for weeks afterward. She knew with absolute certainty that it had been real. The interviewer suggested it was a hallucination. She didn't disagree, but she also didn't seem convinced. "A hallucination doesn't feel like that," she said. "A hallucination doesn't stay in the room after you wake up." This is the gap science struggles to bridge: the subjective reality of the experience versus the objective explanation. The brain misfiring doesn't feel like the brain misfiring. It feels like encountering something real, something present, something that exists independently of your perception. And in some cases, it doesn't stop when the paralysis ends. Reports exist of people experiencing repeated episodes over consecutive nights, each time seeing the same figure, the same entity. Not random hallucinations, but consistent encounters with what feels like a persistent presence. One man documented 43 episodes over 6 months. The figure was always the same: tall, featureless, standing in the corner. Always the corner. Never moving, just watching, waiting. After the 6th month, the episodes stopped. He never saw the figure again, but he still won't sleep in that room. The scientific community categorizes this as sleep paralysis with recurrent hallucinations, possibly triggered by anxiety about future episodes, creating a self-fulfilling psychological loop. But the pattern raises uncomfortable questions. If it's purely neurological, why the consistency within individual cases? Why doesn't the hallucination vary, shift, change with each episode the way dreams do? Why does it feel less like a malfunction and more like a visitation? The earliest known written account of sleep paralysis appears in a 10th century Persian medical text by physician Akawaini Bukhari. He described it as suffocation in sleep, a condition where the patient wakes unable to move, often sensing a great weight upon them. But the experience itself is far older. Ancient Mesopotamian texts reference night demons called Lilitu and Ardat Lili, female spirits who attacked men in their sleep, sat upon their chests and stole their breath. These weren't metaphorical demons. They were documented in medical and religious texts as genuine threats requiring protection amulets and incantations. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest legal documents in existence, includes provisions related to demon attacks during sleep. Why would ancient law acknowledge something purely medical as a supernatural threat? The Romans called it oppressio nocturna, night oppression. They described it in medical terms: a heaviness on the chest, difficulty breathing, temporary inability to move, but they also believed it could be caused by the god Pan visiting in the night, or by witches sending their spirits to torment sleepers. The dual explanation, medical and supernatural existing simultaneously, appears throughout history. In 1664, Dutch physician Isbrand van Diemerbroek published a detailed account of a 50-year-old woman who experienced chronic sleep paralysis. She described a demon sitting on her chest every night for years, crushing her, making breathing impossible. Van Diemerbroek treated it as a medical condition, but he also noted that her symptoms didn't match any known disease, that her recovery only came after a local priest performed a blessing on her home. He recorded both facts without attempting to reconcile them. Medieval grimoires, books of magical instruction, contain specific rituals for protection against night demons. The Lesser Key of Solomon describes entities that attack during sleep. The Munich Manual of Demonic Magic includes prayers to prevent nocturnal oppression. These weren't fringe beliefs held by the uneducated. They were mainstream concerns addressed by the church, documented by physicians, feared by nobility and peasants alike. The story takes an unexpected turn here, because the more we examine historical accounts, the more a pattern emerges that science hasn't adequately addressed. The entities described aren't random, they follow rules. In Newfoundland folklore, the Old Hag can be prevented by placing an object, scissors, a knife, a broom, across the doorway. The object must be crossed, forming an X. This protection method appears in maritime communities that had no contact with European witchcraft traditions. Yet in medieval Germany, the same protection exists. Cross two pieces of metal, place them under the bed or above the door, and the Ma, the night demon, cannot enter. In China, crossing chopsticks serves the same purpose. In Brazil, an open pair of scissors under the pillow. The method is too specific, too consistent to be coincidental convergent evolution of folklore. Either these cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, independently discovered the same symbolic protection against the same hallucination, or they discovered the same protection against the same thing. The historical record also contains accounts that don't fit the sleep paralysis model at all. In 1731, a Serbian military report documented the case of Arnold Powell, a man who claimed to have been attacked by a vampire, what we might now call sleep paralysis. He described the paralysis, the crushing weight, the presence in his room. But unlike typical episodes, there were marks on his body afterward, small puncture wounds on his neck and chest that hadn't been there before. The report was written by military physicians, not superstitious villagers. They examined the marks, they documented them, they had no explanation. Powell died shortly after in an accident, but the attacks continued in his village, other people reporting the same experience, the same paralysis, the same wounds. The situation escalated until Austrian authorities exhumed Paole's body and found it remarkably preserved, leading to the famous vampire hysteria. The sleep paralysis was real, the documentation was real, the physical evidence was real, the explanation remains unclear. Victorian England saw a surge of interest in what they called night terrors, specifically the phenomenon of the nightmare. Artist Henry Fuseli famously painted it in 1781, a woman in paralyzed sleep, a demonic creature sitting on her chest, a horse's head emerging from darkness. The painting became iconic because people recognized it. They'd experienced it, the Incubus demon, the crushing weight, the horse, a symbol of mare, the Germanic night demon, from which we get the word nightmare. But Fuseli's painting includes a detail that disturbs modern viewers. The demon is looking at the viewer, not at the sleeping woman, at you, watching the painting, making eye contact, as if acknowledging that it knows you're there, that it could visit you next. Art historians debate whether this was intentional or artistic instinct, but people who've experienced sleep paralysis recognize it immediately. Because during episodes, the entities do that. They acknowledge you, they demonstrate awareness, they don't behave like hallucinations, random, passive products of your own mind. They behave like something that knows you're trapped, something that enjoys it. To this day, no clear explanation exists for why hallucinations would exhibit purposeful, intelligent behavior. Dreams don't do this. Hypnagogic imagery doesn't do this. Even vivid hallucinations from sleep disorders or psychedelic experiences don't consistently demonstrate this level of apparent autonomy and intent. The 19th century also brought something else: the first attempts at scientific classification. French physician Jean-Baptiste Denis Barboteau proposed that sleep paralysis was caused by blood pooling in the brain during sleep, creating pressure that prevented movement and generated visions. His theory was wrong, but his documentation was meticulous. He recorded 127 cases across 15 years. In 98 of them, patients reported seeing the same type of entity: humanoid, shadow-like, positioned either at the foot of the bed or sitting on the chest. In 43 cases, patients reported the entity had red or glowing eyes. In 31 cases, patients reported a sulphurous or rotting smell accompanying the presence. Barboteau had no framework for understanding why hallucinations would be so consistent across unrelated patients. He noted the pattern, documented it thoroughly, and left it unexplained. His work was largely forgotten until researchers rediscovered it in the 1970s. The patterns he documented still hold. Modern sleep studies confirm that the majority of sleep paralysis hallucinations involve shadowy humanoid figures, that eyes, when visible, are often described as red, glowing, or unusually bright, that olfactory hallucinations, when they occur, tend toward decay, sulfur, or wrongness. If the brain is generating random sensory input during a paralyzed state, why these specific details? Why not the smell of flowers, or lavender, or nothing at all? Why does the misfiring brain consistently choose decay and sulfur, the traditional markers of demonic presence across multiple religious traditions? The anthropological explanation suggests cultural conditioning. We've been taught to associate evil with these sensory markers, so our hallucinations conform to expectation. But that doesn't account for the earliest written records, the ones that established these associations in the first place. Someone experienced something that smelled like sulfur before sulfur became the cultural symbol of demons. Someone saw glowing eyes before glowing eyes became the archetype of evil. The symbol had to come from somewhere. What happened next raised even more questions. In the 1950s, with the advent of modern sleep research and EEG monitoring, scientists could finally observe brain activity during sleep paralysis episodes. They discovered that during REM sleep, the brain is extraordinarily active, in some ways more active than during waking consciousness. The visual cortex fires intensely, the emotional centers surge, and crucially, the temporal lobe, associated with spiritual experiences, sensed presences, and the feeling of encountering something beyond yourself, lights up dramatically. This led to a new theory. Sleep paralysis hallucinations are caused by temporal lobe activity, creating a false sense of presence, which the frightened brain then interprets as threatening. It's a good theory, except in 1967, Dr. Robert Ness conducted a study in Newfoundland, interviewing people who'd experienced Old Hag attacks. He used EEG monitoring on 6 subjects who had recurring episodes. 5 of them showed the expected REM sleep patterns during paralysis. 1 didn't. Subject F, as she was called in the study, experienced full sleep paralysis, complete muscle atonia, conscious awareness, terror, and a vivid hallucination of the Old Hag sitting on her chest, but her EEG showed she was awake. Fully, measurably awake, not in REM sleep, not in any sleep stage. She was conscious, paralyzed, and seeing something that shouldn't be there, while her brain showed normal waking activity. Ness repeated the test 3 times over 6 months. Same result. He published the findings in a regional medical journal. The study was never replicated. Subject F moved away and declined further testing. The anomaly remains in the record, unexplained and largely ignored, because it suggests something uncomfortable, that in at least some cases, what people experience during sleep paralysis isn't happening during sleep at all. In 2008, a documentary filmmaker named Asher Rodney began interviewing people about their sleep paralysis experiences for a film called The Nightmare. What started as an exploration of a medical phenomenon became something stranger. 8 people living in different cities with no connection to each other. All of them described the same entity. Tall, impossibly thin, featureless face, standing in the corner of the room or at the foot of the bed, not moving, just watching, always watching. Rodney found the consistency unsettling enough that he began researching further. He discovered online forums where thousands of people shared sleep paralysis experiences, and among them, a recurring figure emerged. So common it had been given a name: the Hat Man. He appears in bedrooms across the world, tall, wearing what looks like an old-fashioned wide-brimmed hat and a long coat. No face visible in the shadow beneath the hat, no sound, no movement, just presence. Thousands of accounts, same description, same behavior, same overwhelming sense of malevolence. The scientific explanation is mass suggestion. People read about the Hat Man online, then hallucinate him during their own episodes because the image is fresh in their subconscious. But that wasn't the strangest part, because accounts of the Hat Man predate the internet. A 1952 letter to the editor in a Kentucky newspaper describes a tall man in a dark hat and coat appearing during episodes of nighttime paralysis. The writer asked if anyone else had experienced this, hoping for an explanation. 3 people wrote back saying yes. That was 70 years before online forums existed, before people could share these accounts globally and inadvertently create a collective hallucination through cultural exposure. The figure was already there, already consistent, already being seen. In 2011, researchers at California State University conducted a study specifically on recurrent sleep paralysis hallucinations. They found that approximately 35% of chronic sleep paralysis sufferers report seeing the same entity across multiple episodes, not random shadow figures, not different demons each time, the same one. One participant, a 34-year-old woman, had experienced sleep paralysis since childhood. Always the same figure, a small, child-sized shadow that stood beside her bed and whispered things she couldn't quite hear. She described feeling it wanted her to understand something that it was trying to communicate. Over 20 years, hundreds of episodes, the figure never changed. When she was 32, she moved to a different state, new apartment, new bedroom, different bed. The figure appeared the first night, same position, same whispering, same presence. She told the researchers, "Either my brain is incredibly consistent in its misfires, or I brought something with me that won't leave." They categorized her case as chronic recurrent sleep paralysis with fixed hallucination pattern, likely reinforced by anticipatory anxiety. She didn't find the explanation comforting. The study concluded that the consistency of hallucinations across episodes suggested deep neurological patterning. Essentially, the brain creates a template during the first episode and repeats it in subsequent events. But that raises its own question. Why would the brain choose such a specific, threatening template? Why not something neutral or even comforting? Why always something that radiates malevolence, intelligence, intent? Why would evolution build a failure mode into human consciousness that consistently generates the most psychologically damaging experience possible? What happened next raised even more questions. In 2015, a Reddit user posted about their sleep paralysis experience in a thread dedicated to the phenomenon. They described the usual paralysis, the crushing weight, the figure at the end of the bed. But they also mentioned something else. Their dog, sleeping at the foot of the bed, woke up during the episode and began barking, not at them, but at the corner of the room where they saw the figure standing. The dog was terrified, aggressive, focused on something invisible to anyone who might have been watching. When the paralysis broke and the figure vanished, the dog calmed down immediately. Dozens of people replied with similar stories, pets reacting during sleep paralysis episodes, barking, hissing, fleeing the room, behaving as if they sense something present, something wrong. The skeptical explanation is straightforward. The person's distress during paralysis causes changes in breathing, heart rate, or subtle movements that the pet detects and reacts to. But many accounts describe the pet reacting before the person is fully conscious of being paralyzed, the dog barking first, which then wakes the person into awareness of the episode already in progress. If the pet is reacting to the person's distress, how does it sense that distress before the person is aware of it themselves? One woman described her cat, normally affectionate and clingy, refusing to enter her bedroom for 3 weeks after a particularly intense sleep paralysis episode. The cat would sit in the doorway, staring into the room, fur raised, growling, not at her, at something else. On the 22nd day, the cat entered the room again, walked straight to the corner where she'd seen the shadow figure, sniffed the air, and then returned to normal behavior, as if checking whether it was gone. She told her doctor, who referred her to a therapist for anxiety management. The therapist suggested she get rid of the cat to reduce stress. She kept the cat. To this day, no clear explanation exists for why animals would exhibit fear responses during or after their owner's sleep paralysis episodes, particularly when those episodes involve hallucinations that, scientifically, should be invisible to anyone but the person experiencing them. Another pattern has emerged in recent years, one that researchers find difficult to categorize. People experiencing sleep paralysis in new locations, hotels, Airbnbs, friends' homes, and seeing figures that don't match their usual experiences. Different entities, different behavior, but other people who've slept in that same room, that same bed, reporting similar encounters. One Airbnb in New Orleans had to be delisted after 6 separate guests reported identical sleep paralysis episodes. A woman in white at the foot of the bed smelling like roses and decay, whispering in French. The guests had no contact with each other. They left their reviews weeks apart. Different ages, different backgrounds, different countries of origin. Same woman, same smell, same language. The host offered the explanation that the house was built on an old cemetery, that perhaps the building's history psychologically predisposed guests to hallucinate Victorian-era ghosts. But sleep paralysis. Hallucinations should be generated by the individual's brain, not the building's history. Unless the location itself matters somehow, unless something about specific places makes the veil between sleep and waking, between real and hallucinated, thinner. The scientific model doesn't account for this. There's no neurological mechanism by which a room's history could influence the content of a hallucination generated during REM sleep. And yet the reports persist. Hotels where staff quietly know which rooms generate the most sleep paralysis complaints. Apartments where every tenant mentions the shadow in the corner, even when they don't know previous tenants saw it too. College dorms with specific beds that students refuse to sleep in after the first week. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part is what happens when the episodes stop. Most people who experience chronic sleep paralysis eventually find it decreases over time. Better sleep habits, reduced stress, aging out of the condition. the episodes become less frequent, then stop entirely. But a consistent minority report something else. They report that the figures left. Not that the hallucinations stopped, that the entities, specifically, departed, that they could feel the presence withdraw, the room become empty in a way it hadn't been, the weight lift not just from their chest, but from their life. One man described it like this: "I had episodes for 3 years, same figure every time. Then one night I felt it watching me like always, but different, like it was saying goodbye. I haven't had an episode since. But I don't think it's because my brain chemistry changed. I think it left because it was done with me." The psychological explanation suggests that as anxiety about episodes decreases, the brain stops generating them, and people interpret this as the entity leaving rather than their symptoms improving. But these accounts don't describe gradual reduction in frequency. They describe a final encounter, a moment of ending and then nothing, abrupt cessation, not slow improvement. And some of them describe the entity returning years later, not during sleep, not during paralysis, but in moments of extreme stress, illness, or grief. Times when consciousness is altered, when the boundary between waking and sleeping becomes uncertain. A glimpse in the corner during a fever, a sense of presence during a panic attack, the smell of sulfur during a moment of profound loss. Never with paralysis, never during sleep, which doesn't fit the model at all. Because if it's REM atonia causing hallucinations during the sleep-wake transition, these experiences shouldn't happen when someone is fully conscious and mobile. Yet they do. In 2019, Dr. Baland Jalal at Cambridge University proposed a new theory. Sleep paralysis isn't purely neurological. It's a complex interaction between brain states, cultural context, expectation, and genuine altered states of consciousness that may allow perception of stimuli normally filtered out by waking awareness. He stopped short of saying the entities are real, but he didn't say they weren't. His paper was published, critiqued for being too open to paranormal interpretation, and quietly faded from mainstream sleep research. There's another theory, one that exists far outside mainstream science, but has gained quiet traction among those who've experienced chronic episodes. Gnostic teachings, dating back nearly 2,000 years, describe entities called Archons, interdimensional beings that the ancient Gnostics believed ruled the material world. But unlike gods or demons in other traditions, the Archons were described as parasitic, incomplete. Unable to create energy themselves, they required a constant source from elsewhere, from us. The Gnostic texts, many of which were discovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi, Egypt, describe how the Archons feed on human emotional energy, particularly fear, suffering, and terror. They called this energy Loosh, though the term has been adopted and expanded by modern researchers exploring consciousness and paranormal phenomena. It's described as life force, emotional essence, the energy released during intense experiences, especially negative ones. According to Gnostic cosmology, the Archons exist in a realm adjacent to ours, unable to fully manifest in physical reality. But during certain states, illness, deep meditation, moments of altered consciousness, and critically, the liminal space between sleeping and waking, the barrier between worlds thins. They can reach through, they can interact, they can feed. Sleep paralysis, in this framework, isn't a neurological malfunction. It's a vulnerability, a moment when consciousness exists in both worlds simultaneously, awake enough to be aware, asleep enough that the protective barriers of full waking consciousness have dissolved. The theory suggests that what we experience isn't random. The crushing weight on the chest serves a purpose. It intensifies the fear, the helplessness, the sense of being trapped. The malevolent presence isn't incidental, it's deliberate, designed to maximize the emotional response. The entity's apparent awareness isn't a hallucination demonstrating false intelligence, it's actual intelligence, assessing the effectiveness of the harvest. The Gnostics wrote that the Archons appeared as shadow-like figures, often described with animal features or distorted humanoid forms. They were said to be attracted to certain individuals, those who generated particularly intense emotional energy, those in states of spiritual seeking, or those whose consciousness naturally operated closer to the threshold between worlds. This explains patterns the scientific model struggles with, why certain people experience chronic sleep paralysis while others never do, why the entities return to the same individuals repeatedly, as if recognizing a reliable source. Why moving to a new location doesn't stop the episodes. You can't escape something that's not tied to a physical place, but to you specifically. The concept of Loosh gained modern attention through the work of Robert Monroe, founder of the Monroe Institute, who explored out-of-body experiences and altered states of consciousness in the 1970s and 80s. Monroe claimed that during his experiments, he encountered non-physical entities that described Earth as a farm where human emotional energy, Loosh, was cultivated and harvested. He described these entities as feeding on the energy humans generate through intense emotional experiences, with fear being the most potent and easily accessible. Whether Monroe's experiences were genuine encounters or elaborate hallucinations remains debated, but his descriptions align disturbingly well with Gnostic texts written 18 centuries earlier, texts Monroe claimed he'd never read before his experiences began. The theory also addresses the cross-cultural consistency that neuroscience struggles to explain. If different cultures independently hallucinate similar entities due to universal brain architecture, why are the entities specifically designed to maximize fear? Why not neutral figures, or even comforting ones? But if something is actually present, actually feeding, then consistency makes sense. Predators don't vary their hunting techniques randomly, they perfect what works. A lion doesn't decide to hunt like a wolf one day and a crocodile the next. It uses the method evolution, refined over millions of years. If the Archons, or whatever we choose to call them, have been feeding on human fear for millennia, they would have perfected the approach. The shadow figure, the crushing weight, the sense of malevolent presence. These would be the techniques that generate the maximum loosh with the minimum resistance. The theory even explains the smell. Accounts consistently describe sulfurous rotting odors during sleep paralysis episodes. Science attributes this to olfactory hallucinations generated by the brain, but Gnostic and esoteric traditions describe the Archons as entities of decay, corruption, parasitism, beings that exist in the lower vibrational frequencies associated with death and decomposition. The smell wouldn't be a hallucination, it would be the actual signature of their presence crossing into our reality. Critics dismiss the Archon theory as unfalsifiable pseudoscience, because how do you test for interdimensional parasites feeding on invisible emotional energy? You can't measure Loosh in a laboratory. You can't prove or disprove entities that exist outside physical reality. But the same criticism applies to consciousness itself. We can measure brain activity, but we can't measure subjective experience, the feeling of being aware. We know consciousness exists because we experience it directly, not because we can prove it scientifically. Those who've experienced sleep paralysis know something was there, not because they can prove it, because they experienced it directly. With the same certainty, they experience their own consciousness. The Gnostic explanation suggests that sleep paralysis has been misunderstood for centuries, not as a medical condition requiring treatment, but as a predatory relationship requiring protection. This explains why cultures worldwide developed specific defenses: crossed objects above doorways, salt circles, prayers, protective symbols, not to calm psychological anxiety, but to actually repel something real. And according to many who've tried these methods, they work, not always, but often enough that the practices persist across generations. Modern science would say this is placebo effect. The belief in protection reduces anxiety, which reduces the likelihood of sleep paralysis episodes. But those who've lived with chronic sleep paralysis, who've tried medications and sleep hygiene and therapy with limited success, then tried ancient protective rituals and found relief, they're less certain the scientific explanation is complete. But the question remains, sitting in the literature like a presence in a dark room. If sleep paralysis is simply the brain misfiring, Why is the misfire so specific, so consistent, so seemingly aware of the person it's happening to? Why do the hallucinations follow rules, exhibit intelligence, demonstrate continuity across time? Why do they feel less like dreams and more like encounters? Sleep paralysis is real. The physiology is documented, the brain states are measured, the explanations are peer-reviewed and scientifically sound. And yet, across history, across cultures, across thousands of individual testimonies, the same figures appear, the same crushing weight, the same sulphurous smell, the same red eyes watching from the dark. The Old Hag sits on chests in Newfoundland. The Hat Man stands in corners in Tokyo, London, Sao Paulo, Chicago. Shadow people press down on sleepers in languages they don't speak, in places they've never been, following patterns that predate modern communication. Science says your brain paralyzes your body during REM sleep. Consciousness wakes before the paralysis releases, and the frightened mind generates threatening hallucinations to explain the terror it feels. History says demons have always visited in the night, have always crushed breath from lungs, have always appeared in specific forms that demand specific protections. Both can be true, or neither, or something else entirely, something that exists in the space between explanation and experience, where the map of what we know ends and the territory of what we feel begins. Because the people who experience sleep paralysis don't describe it as a medical event. They describe it as an encounter, something that happened to them, not something their brain did to itself. And they describe it with the certainty of witnesses, not patients. Perhaps sleep paralysis is exactly what science says, a harmless neurological quirk, frightening but temporary, explainable through chemistry and electrical impulses. Perhaps the similarities across cultures are coincidence, convergent evolution of folklore, pattern-seeking minds finding meaning in chaos. Perhaps the Hat Man, the Old Hag, the shadow people are nothing more than archetypes bubbling up from a collective unconscious, universal fears given universal form. Perhaps. But somewhere tonight, someone will wake in the dark, unable to move, unable to scream. They will see something standing at the foot of their bed, something that feels old, malevolent, aware, something that has been visiting humans for thousands of years, wearing different names but always the same face. And they will know with absolute certainty that transcends science or reason or skepticism. They are not alone. The question isn't whether sleep paralysis is real. The question is, what else is in the room with us when it happens? What have we been seeing all this time during those moments when consciousness exists between worlds, when we're neither asleep nor awake, neither dreaming nor truly conscious? What lives in that space? What's always been there, waiting for us to be vulnerable enough to see it? We don't have answers. I don't think anyone does. Not completely. Not yet. But we'd like to hear from you. Have you experienced sleep paralysis? What did you see? How did it feel? And more importantly, do you believe the scientific explanation, or does your experience tell you something else is happening, something we haven't found words for yet? Let us know in the comments. Share your story. And if there's a mystery, a phenomenon, an unexplained corner of our weird world you'd like Weird World Files to investigate, let us know. Because the truth, whatever it is still out there, still watching, still waiting in the dark.